The carriage came back 3 hours too soon. That was the first sign something had gone wrong. Madame Orvel knew the rhythm of these things better than anyone. She had been running the Veldenmoor nursery for 22 years, had sent 43 women to noble houses across the kingdom, and had learned that a carriage returning before sundown was never good news. A carriage returning before sundown meant the man had made up his mind fast, and men who made up their minds fast were never doing the woman any favors. She was standing at the front window of the parlor, pressing a crease out of a silk blouse that didn't need pressing, when she heard the wheels on the cobblestone. She counted the beats of her own heart. 1, 2, 3. Then she set the blouse down, smoothed the front of her gray dress, and walked to the door before any of the girls could get there first. The nursery was not what people imagined when they heard the word. It was not a cold place. It was not a cage, though some whispered it was. It was a tall, amber-bricked manor house at the edge of the capital, with wide corridors and high ceilings and windows that let in more light than most noble homes could boast. Madame Orvel had insisted on the windows. Girls grow toward light, she always said, same as everything else worth keeping alive. There were 16 girls in residence that autumn. Not children, women between the ages of 18 and 26, each one sent to the nursery by a family that either couldn't afford to launch them into society independently or believed they needed what Madame Orvel called finishing. Etiquette, poise, languages, the careful art of entering a room and making people want to know your name. They were, on any given morning, a spectacular amount of noise. Laughter in the upper corridor. Debates at the breakfast table that went on longer than they should. Someone always at the pianoforte. Usually Bet, who was brilliant and knew it. Someone always crying over a letter from home. Usually Safi, who was 17 and had not yet learned to hide her heart. Drina stealing bread from the kitchen at odd hours. Corey reading novels she kept hidden inside her etiquette manuals. Madame Orvel knew all of it. She missed nothing. And she loved them, every loud, imperfect, hopeful one of them, in the way a woman loves things she has spent her life protecting. Which was exactly why, when she opened the front door and saw what was coming up the garden path, something inside her chest folded quietly in half. Tessely didn't look up when she walked through the gate. She was 23, and she had been one of Madame Orvel's finest, not just beautiful, which she was, with warm ivory skin and soft brown curls, and a smile that made people feel like they had known her for years, but genuinely fine, poised, kind without being naive, funny in the dry, quiet way that took people a moment to catch. Madame Orvel had spent 8 months preparing her. 8 months. She had believed, with something close to certainty, that Tessely was the one who would finally satisfy Count Lucien Caro of Veldenmoor. She was not. Tessely came up the path with her suitcase in her right hand, and her left arm wrapped tight around her own middle, the way a person holds themselves together when they are the only thing keeping themselves from falling apart. Her curls, which she had pinned so carefully that morning, had come half undone. Her traveling coat was buttoned wrong, one side higher than the other, as though she had dressed in a hurry or hadn't been looking. Her eyes were dry. That was the worst part, Madame Orvel thought. The dry eyes. Tessely had cried already, somewhere between Veldenmoor and here, and had run out. She stopped when she reached the door, looked up at Madame Orvel, and something in her face, some last thin wall she had been holding all the way home, simply gave. Madame, she started. Come inside, Madame Orvel said quietly. He said. Her voice broke on the word. She pressed her lips together hard, tried again. He didn't even. I had barely sat down for the second dinner before he. Come inside, Tessely. Madame Orvel reached out and took the suitcase from her hand. It was heavier than it should have been, and she didn't let herself think about what it meant, that Tessely had repacked everything so quickly. Come inside first. Then you can say whatever you need to say. They were already in the corridor. Of course they were. Madame Orvel had hoped, foolishly perhaps, that the sound of the carriage wouldn't carry upstairs, that she would have 5 minutes at least to settle Tessely somewhere private before. But there they were. 6 of them on the staircase, frozen mid-step. Bet at the top, hand on the banister, her clever face going carefully neutral the way it did when she was trying not to show she was alarmed. Safi 2 steps below her, already wide-eyed, already pressing her hand over her mouth. Corey in the corridor doorway, still holding her hidden novel, forgotten. Drina had appeared from the direction of the kitchen, flower on her sleeve, going still the moment she saw Tessely's face, and Elin. Elin was at the bottom of the stairs, closest to the door, which meant she was the first one Tessely saw when she stepped inside. Elin was 21, and she had been at the nursery for 3 years, longer than most, which was either a testament to how much Madame Orville valued her or a quiet indictment of how difficult she was to place, depending on who you asked. She was not the kind of woman that appeared on the short lists of counts and lords and landed gentlemen. She knew it. She had stopped minding, or had learned, at least, to wear not minding with enough conviction that it looked like peace. She was dark-skinned, broad-shouldered for a woman of her height, with deep brown eyes that missed very little, and a mouth that, in Madame Orville's experience, was never still for long. Her hair was thick and natural, pulled back today in a knot that had won against exactly 2 of the pins she had used to tame it. She was, by every metric on every list Madame Orville had ever received from a prospective match, not quite right. But she was the one Tessely looked at, and she was the one who moved first. "Hey!" Elin stepped forward, closing the distance between them before anyone else had found their feet. Her voice came out low and even, the way you talk to someone standing on the edge of something. "Hey Tessely, give me your coat." Tessely blinked at her. "Your coat," Elin said again gently. "Let me take it. You look like it weighs 1,000 pounds. Something about the smallness of the request, the simple, ordinary kindness of it, undid what little Tessely had left. She made a sound, not quite a word, not quite a sob. Something that lived in between the two, something that had no name because most people don't make it in front of other people. And then she was crying in earnest, the way you cry when you've been holding it since before noon, great shaking breaths that she clearly hadn't meant to let out. And Elin put one arm around her shoulders and steered her firmly toward the parlor settee, like she had been doing this her whole life. The others came down the stairs without being asked. Safi, who cried easily and wasn't ashamed of it, was already blinking hard. She sat close to Tessely on the settee and took her hand and held it in both of hers without saying a word, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. Drina disappeared back toward the kitchen. Everyone knew she expressed care through food. And sure enough, she returned 4 minutes later with hot tea and a plate of the sugar biscuits she had apparently been making when the carriage arrived. Corey set her novel face down on the windowsill, her full attention given over. Bet stood near the door with her arms folded, jaw tight, watching. Madame Orville set Tessely's suitcase by the stairs and came to stand at the edge of the room. She said nothing. Sometimes the kindest thing a woman in charge can do is step back and let the room hold someone. It took a while for Tessely to find words. When she did, they came out in pieces, broken up by breath. "I thought I did everything. I practiced the walk you showed me, madame. The whole way in the carriage I had the answers ready. I knew what topics he favored. She pressed the back of her hand to her lips. He looked at me, just looked at me, and his face, he didn't even try to hide it, like I was a wrong order that had been delivered to his table. The parlor was very quiet. "What did he say?" Bet asked. Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were not. Tessely laughed. It came out wrong. He said that my complexion was pleasant, but that he had been quite specific about what he was looking for, that perhaps the nursery had misread his requirements. She looked down at her hands. He was very polite about it. That's what I keep thinking. He was so terribly, terribly polite. Pleasant, Elin thought. The word sat in her stomach like something she had swallowed wrong. "He sent for the carriage before we'd finished the second course," Tessely said quietly. "He didn't even let me finish eating." Safi made a small wounded sound. "This is the third," Corey said suddenly. Everyone looked at her. She had her arms wrapped around herself, chin up, but her voice was careful. "Third woman he's sent back from the nursery. Marin last spring. Hilded in the winter before that now Tessely." She looked at Madame Orville. "When does someone say something to him?" The question hung in the room. Madame Orville's face did the thing it did when she was carrying something heavy and choosing not to put it down. "Count Caro is a man of significant rank," she said. "He is entitled to his preferences." "His preferences," Bet repeated, flatly. "Marin came back and didn't speak for a week. A week, madame. She sat in her room and I brought her meals on a tray because she wouldn't come to the table. And you're telling me that's just preferences?" Bet. "I'm not being dramatic. I'm stating what happened. I know what happened." Madame Orville's voice was quiet but firm, the kind of quiet that comes after years of knowing when to hold the line. "And I know it isn't right. But there are rules to how this. He's going to send another notice." Everyone turned. It was Elin who had spoken. She hadn't moved from where she stood beside the settee, but something in her voice made the room pay attention. She was looking at Madame Orville. "Isn't he? He always does. A few weeks, maybe a month, and there'll be another letter with that same list." Madame Orville didn't answer, which was, in its own way, an answer. Tessely let out a breath. "The list," she said softly, like the words tasted of something stale. "He had it framed, did you know that?" He had it framed and hung in the dining room, where you have to look at it while you eat. She gave another broken almost law. She must shine like the rays of the sun. Fair skin, unmarked. Golden hair, eyes the color of a winter sky, graceful, soft, perfect. She looked up. I memorized it. I thought, if I know it well enough, I can understand what he wants, and maybe I can. I don't know. Be it for long enough. No one spoke. You can't be it, Elin said, not unkindly. Just simply, the way you say a thing that is true. Because it isn't a woman he's describing. It's a painting. Paintings don't talk back. Paintings don't think, or eat or want things. And when a real woman walks into that room and turns out to be a real woman, she stopped, pressed her mouth shut for a moment. Then she looked at Madame Orvel. When does the next notice come? Elin. When, Madame? Madame Orvel looked at her for a long moment. The firelight caught the silver at her temples, the deep lines at the corners of her eyes that 22 years of this work had carved there. She looked tired, Elin thought. Not the tiredness of a day, the tiredness of a long time. I received a preliminary letter this morning, Madame Orvel said quietly, before the carriage came back. He is already preparing a new request. The room absorbed this. Tessie made a small sound and looked away toward the window. Elin nodded once, slowly, like something had been confirmed that she had been turning over in her mind for longer than just today. Then I'll go, she said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the one before. Madame Orvel's expression shifted. I'll go, she said it again evenly. Put my name forward. Send me Elin. Madame Orvel's voice had dropped. You've read his requirements. You've just heard his requirements. I know. Then you understand that by every description he has written you are not. I know, Elin said again. And there was something in her eyes now that wasn't anger, exactly, and wasn't grief. Exactly. It was something that sat between the two, something patient and deliberate and very, very decided. I know I'm not what he's looking for. She looked at Tessely, at Sophie still holding Tessely's hand, at Bedit, jaw still tight by the door. Then quietly, that's why I should be the one to go. Chapter 1. The room did not cheer when Elin said she would go. That was telling. When Marin had been selected 8 months ago, there had been excitement. The bright, nervous kind that fills a room the way perfume does. Too much all at once. Everyone talking over each other. Someone finding flowers from the garden to put in her hair as a joke that turned tender. When Hild had gone before her, there had been tears, the good kind, the kind that come from being proud of someone you love. The nursery had always sent its women off with something. Noise, at least. The warmth of being seen on your way out the door. When Elin said she would go, the room went quiet in a way that felt less like reverence and more like collective breath-holding. Like watching someone walk toward something they shouldn't. Madame Orvel looked at her for a long time. Long enough that the fire in the grate shifted and popped, and Sophie quietly released Tessely's hand, and the weight in the room rearranged itself into something new. Then the older woman said very carefully, I will not stop you. But I will ask you once and I will need an honest answer. She paused. Why, Elin? Elin thought about giving her the short answer. The safe one. Because someone should. Because it might as well be me. Instead, she looked at Tessely, at the wrongly buttoned coat, at the careful ruin of her pinned curls, at the particular way she was holding her own hand in her lap now, like she was the only thing she had left to hold, and she said, because he needs to understand what he's doing. And I think I'm the only one here who'll make sure he does. Madame Orvel closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. That is not the same as wanting to marry him. No, Elin agreed. It isn't. Another long silence. Then Madame Orvel nodded, once, with the resigned precision of a woman who had lived long enough to know the difference between a decision she could change and one that had already been made. I'll write the letter tonight, she said. And she left the room without another word, which was how Madame Orvel always made the hardest choices, quickly, before she could talk herself into softness. Bet was the first to speak after she left. You know what he's going to do when he sees you? Yes, Elin said. You know how it felt for Tessely. For Marin. You know it'll be the same. It won't be the same, Elin said. Because I'm not going for the same reason. Bet studied her for a long moment with those sharp, assessing eyes that made her both the best and the most exhausting person to sit across from at any table. Then, slowly, she nodded. Not agreement, exactly. More like the specific acknowledgement of someone who has understood a plan they're not entirely comfortable with. Don't let him make you small, she said. Whatever he does, don't let him press you down. He won't, Elin said. She believed it. She had to. She packed that night after the others had gone to bed. She was not a complicated packer. 3 years at the nursery had taught her the difference between what she owned and what she needed, and she had always found the gap between those two things useful. It meant she could move quickly, could leave cleanly, didn't require the kind of prolonged and emotional farewell that attached itself to too much luggage. She folded 2 good dresses, one dark green, one the color of turned earth, and set them in her case alongside her books, her hairpins, the small jar of the oil she used on her hair because the nursery's climate did it no favors, and the letter. The letter she had kept. It had come to Madame Orville 3 months ago, the first preliminary correspondence from Veldenmoor, not the official request, just the preliminary, just the opening salvo of Count Lucien Caro's newest attempt to acquire a wife. Madame Orville had read it to them over breakfast, as she always did, in her brisk, uninflected way, because she believed the women in her care deserved to know what the world expected of them. Elin had asked afterward if she could keep a copy. Madame Orville had looked at her strangely but said yes. She had read it many times since, not because she needed to memorize it, but because she had learned, early and well, that if you wanted to understand what a person truly believed, you should look not at what they said about themselves, but at what they asked for, what they demanded, what they wrote down and framed on a wall and presented as reasonable. She unfolded it now. The lady sought by Count Lucien Caro of Veldenmoor must present as follows. Fair of skin, unmarked and unblemished. Her hair ought to be golden or of a similarly luminous shade. Her eyes should carry the pale clarity of a winter sky. She must be graceful in her bearing, soft in her manner, measured in her speech. She must, in all ways, shine like the rays of the sun. She must shine like the rays of the sun. Elin read it 3 times. Then she folded it and put it in the front pocket of her case, where she could find it easily. She sat on the edge of her bed for a while after that, in the quiet of the room she had shared for 3 years with Marin. Marin's bed was still there, still made, with the blue quilt Marin had brought from home, and refused to leave behind, even when Madame Orville suggested the nursery's linens were more appropriate. It was perfectly flat, perfectly smooth, the way a bed looks when no one has slept in it for a long time. Marin had taken the quilt when she left for Veldenmoor. She had not brought it back. Whether she had left it there, or whether it had simply stayed in the carriage, or whether it had been lost in the rush of being sent away again, Elin didn't know, and had never been able to ask, because Marin, when she came back, had not been able to talk about it. Not the quilt, not the estate, not the dinner, not the moment his expression had shifted, not the carriage ride home, not any of it. She had come through the nursery door and gone up the stairs and sat on her bed, the blue quilt still gone, the mattress bare beneath her, and she had looked at the wall for a very long time. Elin had sat with her. She had not tried to fill the silence, because she had understood instinctively that the silence wasn't empty. It was full of something Marin was still holding, and if Elin said the wrong word at the wrong moment it might spill. They had sat there until the light went out of the window. Then Marin had said very quietly, "I don't think I'm funny anymore." Elin had frowned. "What? I used to think I was funny. I had a hole. There were things I said, jokes, the kind of jokes that made people actually laugh, not just to be polite. I was certain of it." She had been looking at the wall. "He looked at me the way you look at something you've ordered that came wrong. And I keep thinking, maybe I was never funny. Maybe everything I thought I was is just something I made up because no one had ever looked at me that way before." Elin had not known what to say. She had been 20 years old, and she was sharp about many things, but she had not yet had to find words for the particular cruelty of someone making another person a stranger to themselves. She had said eventually, "You're the funniest person I know. That's not a thing a look can take." Marin had nodded slowly like she was filing it away for later, for a time when she might be able to use it. She had left the nursery 4 months after she returned, gone home to her family's farm in the east, because she said the city felt too big now, and small was easier. She sent letters. Elin wrote back. The letters were fine, warm even, talking about the chickens and her sister's children, and the particular bad weather they had been having, but they were not Marin. Marin on paper was a quieter thing than Marin in a room had ever been, and that distance, that absence of her noise, was the thing that lived in Elin's chest like a coal that never fully cooled. One look from one man, one dinner he hadn't let her finish, and Marin had become someone who had to relearn herself from scratch, alone, in a farmhouse in the east, one small ordinary day at a time. She must shine like the rays of the sun. Elin looked at Marin's empty bed for a long time. Then she lay down, stared at the ceiling, and did not sleep for quite a while. She had never, in her life, been anyone's idea of luminous. She knew this the way you know the things that are true about yourself before anyone has to say them. The way you absorb the shape of yourself from 1,000 small moments that are not quite looks, and not quite words, but land somewhere between the two and stay. She had known it at 14, in the village where she grew up, where the standard of beauty was very clear, and she was not it. She had known it at 17, when her mother had sent her to the nursery, with the particular bright, aching hope of a woman who loves her daughter, and does not know how to say, "I want better for you than this, and I don't know how to give it to you myself." She had known it at 18 and 19, and through all of 20 and 21, as the shortlists came and went, and her name appeared on none of them. She had made her peace with this, or something that resembled peace, if you didn't look too closely. What she had never made peace with was the idea that the absence of luminosity was the same as the absence of worth. That the light you carried had to be a particular color to count. That a woman could be whole and sharp and capable of enormous feeling and still be assessed, at a dinner table, like livestock at a market. Pleasant but not quite what I ordered, and sent home to become someone who had to relearn their own laughter. That she could not forgive, had not in 8 months made any progress toward forgiving, and so she was going to Veldenmoor, not to be chosen, not to perform, not to wear her hair in a way that might approximate gold in candlelight, not to powder her skin or lower her voice, or make herself smaller than she was. She was going to walk into his estate exactly as she was, and she was going to look Count Lucian Caro of Veldenmoor in the eye, and she was going to make sure he understood, in whatever way she had to, through whatever means available to her, what his list had cost, what his requirements had done, what the word pleasant had stolen from her best friend. She was not going to be soft about it. She had never been particularly soft about anything, and she saw no reason to start. The carriage left at first light. Madame Orvel was at the door. She had the look she always had when she was sending someone off, composed, precise, the emotion tucked somewhere interior where it did its work quietly. She pressed a small envelope into Ellen's hand. "Your credentials," she said. "My letter of introduction and—" She paused. Her expression shifted by a degree that most people would have missed. "A personal note. From me. You don't have to read it now." Ellen looked at the envelope. "Will it tell me not to do this?" "No." Madame Orvel's voice was dry. "I learned 20 years ago that telling you not to do something was a reliable method of ensuring you did it. A beat. It says other things." Ellen nodded and put the envelope in her coat pocket. Then, because she was not good at long goodbyes, and Madame Orvel was not either, she picked up her case and climbed into the carriage. The others were at the upstairs windows. She could see them without looking directly. Safi's face open and worried. Corey leaning against the frame. Bet, arms folded, who gave her a single nod when their eyes met, the kind that meant "I see you and I mean it." Tessely was not at the window. Tessely was still in bed, which was where she had a right to be, and Ellen hoped she was sleeping, and she hoped when she woke up she would eat something. And she hoped, quietly, in the part of herself that she didn't often let people see, that she would come back from this with something that might, eventually, help. The carriage lurched forward. The nursery fell behind. The journey to Veldenmoor took the better part of a day. Ellen spent it reading the letter. Not Madame Orvel's letter. She was saving that, the way you save something you suspect might undo you, for a moment when being undone would be less inconvenient. She read the Count's list. His requirements, his impossible precise, framed on the dining room wall declaration of what a woman should be. She read it forward. She read it backward. She read it aloud, once, quietly, to the empty carriage in the passing countryside, and heard in her own voice something she hadn't fully registered on the page. How certain it was. How utterly, completely certain. The way it was written, there was no allowance for the possibility that he might be wrong. No clause that acknowledged he was describing a type rather than a person. No admission that the thing he was looking for might not exist, or that its non-existence might be his failing, rather than the failing of every woman he sent away. She must shine like the rays of the sun. Not "I hope she will." Not "it would please me if must," as though it were a fact of the universe. As though women were made in workshops to specification, and if yours came out wrong, you were simply entitled to send it back. By the third reading, Ellen was not angry in the hot, immediate way that made her want to raise her voice. She was angry in the deep, settled way that is far more useful. The kind that makes you patient, makes you strategic, makes you capable of walking into a room with your chin level, and your eyes clear and your hands perfectly still. She folded the letter, put it back in her pocket, looked out the window at the countryside going dark at the edges as the sun began its descent. She thought about Marin, in her farmhouse in the east, feeding chickens in the morning light, writing letters that were fine and warm but not quite her. She thought about Tessely's wrongly buttoned coat. She thought about the word pleasant, and what it cost, and who paid it. Then she stopped thinking and just watched the trees. Veldenmoor announced itself before the estate did. It was in the air first, something colder, sharper, the particular quality of altitude that makes each breath feel more deliberate. Then the trees changed, growing taller and darker, and more certain of themselves, lining the road on both sides like they had been placed there by someone who understood the value of arrival. The road itself widened, smoothed, became the kind of road that was maintained with intention. Everything about the approach said, "A man of significance lives here. Prepare yourself accordingly." Elin had no intention of preparing herself accordingly. The estate emerged from the tree line at dusk, exactly, as though it had timed itself. It was vast in the way that old money is vast. Not showy, not reaching, simply there in the confident way of things that have occupied their space for long enough to stop justifying it. Stone. Tall windows, each one lit from within, gold against the darkening sky. Torches at the gate, at the path, at the great front steps, so that the whole of the approach was lit in warm flickering orange that made everything it touched look like it was breathing. The carriage slowed, stopped.
A man in a state livery appeared at the door and opened it without a word, offering a hand she didn't take, stepping back as she climbed down with her case and set both feet on the ground and stood. She stood for a moment with the torchlight moving against her skin and the cold air of Veldenmoor filling her lungs and the house enormous ahead of her, every window a lit eye. She had expected to be nervous. She found to her own interest that she was not. What she was ready. He was at the top of the steps. She hadn't expected that. She had expected a butler, a housekeeper, someone with a clipboard and a schedule and instructions about where she should wait. She had not expected the Count himself to be standing at the top of his own front steps in the half-dark, watching the carriage approach. She noticed things, in the order that they registered. He was tall. He was younger than she had imagined, or rather more precisely aged. Somewhere in his early 30s, with the particular quality of a man who had looked serious for so long it had become structural. Dark hair. A jaw that could have been drawn by someone trying to illustrate composed. A coat that was fine without trying to prove it. He stood the way people stand when standing still is something they've practiced. Weight evenly distributed. Nothing restless, nothing given away. He was watching the carriage door. He watched her step out. She watched him see her. It happened across 30 feet of torchlit gravel, and it lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and she would think about it for much longer than that afterward. Not because it wounded her, but because of what it was. His face did not curl, did not sneer, did not do any of the things she had braced for, the open dismissals, the visible disappointment, the polite blankness that was somehow worse than both. His face went still. Completely, entirely still, like a man who has been handed something unexpected and has not yet decided what to do with it. Like a man who had written she must shine like the rays of the sun, and had just been confronted with something that made no reference to the sun at all. Something that stood in torchlight like it had always stood in torchlight, like it had never needed the sun to be entirely, solidly, undeniably there. Elin looked back at him. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took to make her point. Then she picked up her case and walked toward the steps and felt, for the first time since Marin had come home without her blue quilt, something that might have been the beginning of satisfaction. Chapter 2. He did not speak to her until dinner. That itself was a statement. She was shown to her room by a housekeeper, who moved like she had been trained not to make sound, given an hour to dress, and then escorted to a dining room that was longer than it needed to be, with candles arranged to flatter and silverware polished to mirror. Everything in Veldenmoor was like that, precise, considered, designed to communicate that the man who lived here had standards, high ones, non-negotiable ones. The list was on the wall exactly as Tessely had said, framed, mounted, hung where you had to look at it while you ate. Elin looked at it for a long moment when she sat down. Then she unfolded her napkin, laid it across her lap, and said nothing. Lucian arrived 4 minutes later, sat, nodded once. The meal began. He was, at close range, even more controlled than he had appeared on the steps. He asked her the expected questions, her family, her education, her interests, in the tone of a man completing a checklist he already suspected would come up short. She answered each one honestly, without performance, without the particular bright eagerness she had watched other women wear to these things like armor. When he asked about her accomplishments, she told him she was good with numbers, better with people, and had strong opinions about most things. He looked at her over his wineglass. "The nursery described you as accomplished," he said. "The nursery described me accurately," she said. A pause. The candles moved. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but the faint alertness of a man who has not been surprised in a while and has just unexpectedly been surprised. Then he looked back at his plate and said, quite carefully, I will be honest with you, Miss Elin. I made my requirements known, clearly and in advance. I am uncertain why Madame Orvel would send someone who does not meet them. Elin set down her fork. The sound it made against the china was very small and absolutely deliberate. I imagine, she said, she sent me because the women you've been returning are coming back broken. And someone needed to come here and tell you that. The room went airless. Across the table, Lucian Caro went very still, same stillness as the steps, but different now, closer, with nowhere to go. A muscle moved in his jaw. I have been perfectly civil to every woman. Marin didn't laugh for a month. Her voice was even, quiet. A scalpel, not a hammer. Tessely buttoned her coat wrong on the way home, because she wasn't steady enough to button it right. These are not women you were simply not suited for. These are women you looked at like they were errors. And they believed you. Silence. Long, particular, airless silence. You may go, he said quietly. I'll have the carriage arranged for morning. No, Elin said. He looked up. She met his eyes. I'll leave when my 3 days are finished. That is the arrangement Madame Orvel made, and I intend to honor it. She picked her fork back up. You may ignore me for the remainder of dinner if you like, but I'm not leaving the table. He did not have her removed. She didn't know if that was dignity or something else. She suspected it was something else. The faint, unwilling recognition of a man who had never had anyone simply refuse him before, and didn't quite know what to do with the novelty of it. She finished her meal. She did not look at the list on the wall again, but she felt it there, framed and certain and wrong, and she thought about the portrait she had glimpsed when she passed the study door on the way to her room. A painting. A woman, golden-haired, pale-eyed, luminous in the specific way of things that cannot answer back. That's what this is, she had thought. He isn't looking for a wife. He's looking for a resurrection. And something about that. Not sympathy, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Settled in her chest like an ember she hadn't asked for and didn't entirely want. She went to bed with it anyway. Chapter 3, the second day. She argued with his groundskeeper for 20 minutes about the roses. She hadn't planned to. She had been walking the garden. Not for leisure, simply because she woke early, and the estate felt too interior, too controlled, and she needed air that didn't come with silverware. When she found old Pet crouched at the far bed, preparing to pull up 3 rose bushes that had gone brown at the edges. They're not dead, she said, without introduction. Pet looked up at her, looked back at the roses. They're dying. That's different. They're drought-stressed. The soil's pulling away from the roots. See that gap? They need water and cutting back, not pulling up. Pet stared at her. I grew up working in outer fields, she said, already crouching beside him. Already pressing 2 fingers into the soil to feel the depth of the dry. I know what dying looks like. This isn't it. She didn't find out until later that Lucien had been watching from the upper window. The second evening, she read in the sitting room with 1 candle, because she hadn't wanted to ask where the lamps were kept, and the single flame was enough. She wasn't performing quietness. She simply liked it. The specific quality of a room held by 1 small light, the way it made the book feel more serious, more like something worth the effort. She looked up once and found him in the doorway. He didn't say anything, neither did she. He stood there for a moment in the half-dark, not in his formal coat, just shirt sleeves and an expression she hadn't seen on him yet, something unguarded, and then he walked away. She turned the page. The 3rd morning she laughed at breakfast loudly. The housekeeper, Mrs. Galt, who had thawed approximately 3 degrees since the dinner incident, had said something dry and self-deprecating about the state of the kitchen garden. And Elin had laughed in the real way, the whole-body way, the way that doesn't ask permission. She clapped her hand over her mouth a half-second after. The old instinct, the nursery-trained reflex of too much, make it smaller. Then she took her hand away and let the laugh finish. When she looked up, Lucian was watching her from across the table with an expression she could not immediately name. It wasn't displeasure. It wasn't the clinical assessment she had come to expect from him. It was something she had no word for yet. Something that looked almost like a man recognizing a sound he had forgotten existed. He looked away before she could examine it. She found him in the study that afternoon. She hadn't meant to intrude. The door was ajar, and she had knocked, and he had said, "Come in the way people say things when they are thinking about something else." The portrait was on the far wall, larger than she had realized from the doorway, and now that she was fully in the room she could see it clearly for the first time. The woman in it was beautiful. golden-haired, pale, luminous in the posed and careful way of formal portraits, but underneath the formality something genuine. A slight lift at the corner of the mouth, eyes that seemed, even in paint, to be holding a thought back. A woman who had been known by the person who commissioned her portrait, who had been seen. Elin looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Lucien, who was looking at it the way people look at wounds they have stopped bothering to cover. Who was she? Elin asked quietly. A pause. My mother. She hadn't expected that. She adjusted. She died when I was 12, he said, still looking at the portrait. His voice was even, which meant it had been practiced. She was exactly as you see her. Warm, brilliant. The kind of person a room reorganized itself around without her asking. He stopped. I spent 20 years not understanding why no one I met felt like a room I wanted to be in. It took me longer than it should have to understand that I wasn't looking for a wife. A long pause. I was looking for her. The room was very quiet. Elin looked at the portrait, at the slight lift of the painted mouth, the held-back thought. She was a person, she said. Gently, but without softness, there was a difference, and she had always known it. Not a type, not a color of hair or a shade of skin. She was a specific, unrepeatable person, and you cannot write her down in a list and send for her, because she's gone. She paused. And every woman you sent back was also a specific, unrepeatable person. And you looked at them and found them guilty of not being someone they never knew they were supposed to be. He closed his eyes. Not dramatically, just closed them. Like something had been pressing on him for a very long time, and he had finally quietly stopped holding it back. When he opened them, he looked different. Not undone, he was too composed for undone, but opened, like a window after a long winter. I know, he said, very quietly. I know that. Marin was funny, Elin said. She was the funniest person I have ever known. She came back not knowing if she still was. She held his gaze. You did that. Yes. The word cost him something. She could see it costing him. They sat with that for a moment. Then he reached across the narrow space between them and placed his hand over hers on the desks. Not a claim, not a gesture of romance. The way a person reaches for something solid when the ground has moved under them. She looked down at his hand. She should have moved hers. She didn't. She left it there. Barely, just barely, and felt something shift in the room that had nothing to do with the portrait, or the list, or the 3 women who had come before her. Something that was only precisely this. She had come to make him reckon. She had not expected to watch him do it. She had not expected it to matter. Chapter 4 she packed before dawn, not because she had given up, because she had always known this was how it ended. The carriage arriving, the answer given, the road back to the nursery, taken with whatever she had managed to leave behind in this house. She had come to say something true to someone who needed to hear it. She had said it. Whatever he did with it was no longer hers to carry. She folded her dark green dress, her earth-colored one, her books, the oil for her hair. She moved quietly and deliberately, the way she did everything, and she did not let herself sit on the edge of the bed and think too long about the study, or the portrait, or his hand over hers, or the particular look on his face. It said I know and meant it in the way that costs something. She tucked the counts list into the front pocket of her case. Then she thought about it, took it back out, left it on the nightstand. She didn't need it anymore. She had learned everything it had to teach her. The carriage was at the gate at 7, punctual and unmoved by the frost on the ground, or the pale early light, or any of the things that had happened inside the house over 3 days. It simply waited as carriages do, indifferent to outcomes. Elin came down the stairs with her case in hand and her chin level. He was at the bottom, not in his formal coat, not composed into the particular architecture of Count Lucien Caro of Veldenmoor. He was in plain clothes, a little undone at the collar, with the look of a man who had been awake since before the dark lifted and had made some decision in the hours between, and was now standing inside it, waiting to see if it would hold. She stopped on the last step. They looked at each other. In his hands was the list, the original. She could see his own handwriting on it, darker and more deliberate than the copies. The words she had memorized and folded and carried and finally left upstairs on a nightstand, because she was done with them. He tore it, slowly, precisely, the way he did everything, with full intention, nothing accidental, first in half, then in half again, then again until the pieces were small enough that they fell from his hands like the aftermath of something that had never deserved to last this long. He let them fall. I don't want the sun, he said. His voice was quiet and unperformed. I've been standing in the dark long enough to know I want whatever it is you are. The hallway was very still. Elin looked at the pieces on the floor, at his face, at the open, unguarded, slight terrifying honesty of a man who had stopped hiding inside his own requirements. She thought about Marin, about Tessely's coat, about 30 feet of torchlit gravel, and the moment his face had gone still, and she had felt, for the first time in months, something like purpose. She had not come here to be chosen. She had come here to make him understand, and she could see it, unmistakably, in the way he was standing, not reaching, not performing. Just there, at the bottom of his own staircase, in plain clothes, having torn up the blueprint he had been hiding behind for years. He understood. He was standing inside that understanding without flinching. It was, she thought, a beginning, not a resolution, not an answer, a beginning. She stepped off the last stair. "You'll have to learn her name," she said. "The woman you're asking to stay, it's Elin. Not suitable, not a wife, not whatever it is you are. A beat, Elin. Start there." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, something quieter than a smile, something that lived in the territory before smiles, where things are felt before they are expressed. "Elin," he said, like he was learning the weight of it, like he intended to keep it. She held his gaze for one long, unhurried moment. Then she set her case down at the foot of the stairs, not with relief, not with surrender, with the particular, deliberate calm of a woman making her own choice. For the first time in this story, entirely her own, and knowing the difference between that and everything that came before it. Outside, the carriage waited. Then eventually it left. Without her, she had not come to shine. She had come to burn through the list, the portrait, the careful architecture of a man hiding from his own grief. She had done that. And what remained, when the burning was finished, was something neither of them had written down. Something that had no requirements. Something that was only finally true.